Thanks for being with us today, and welcome to today's webinar presentation brought to you by the IEEE Standards Association Corporate Membership Program. My name is David Stankiewicz. I am the event producer for our session today on blockchain, the game changer in the optimization and efficacy of clinical trials. This webinar is intended to be an interactive session, so we're going to feature about 40 to 45 minutes of presentation from our guest speakers, followed by about 15 to 20 minutes of live Q&A with you, the audience. Without further ado, I'll let Maria take control of the slide deck here, and I will kick it over to our moderator. Maria, take it away.
Being with us today in our next edition of the IEEE blockchain webcast. We're really excited about the opportunity to really bring this application of blockchain in the world of clinical trials. So just a little bit for those of you, we have such a mix, a great hybrid of audience here today. We have people who are really familiar with blockchain, but not so familiar with the process of clinical trials. And then we have people who are familiar with clinical research and clinical trials who are trying to understand how blockchain can help them. So just to put in perspective, there's some statistics here for you that we've aggregated off different websites. But one of the things that really comes to mind when we think about blockchain applications and clinical trials is that it's approximate between 3 to 5% of adult cancer patients actually participate in oncology clinical trials. And that's a small population when we think about, unfortunately, the rising rate of cancer patients globally. And the effect of enrollment in any kind of clinical trials is that right now we're realizing that 80% of clinical trials fail to meet their enrollment timeline. Basically, what that means is that inhibits the advancement of an innovation in drug development. That means it takes longer for drugs to get to market, takes longer for them to get to the approval process. And when we talk about, our experts here today are going to talk about blockchain as an application to help us in the world of patient recruitment, how that will work. We're going to talk about also the idea of data integrity and how we can sort of maybe a little bit close the gap between clinical research and medical. So like I mentioned, I'm very excited to have a panel of experts here with me here today. I have Vladimir Provenance from he's a PhD. He's with the clinical biomarkers and diagnostics at Amgen. Vladimir he has a PhD in biochemistry and molecular genetics at the University of Illinois at Chicago, and he completed his postdoctoral training at Lurie Cancer Center of Northwestern in Chicago, and his work focused on molecular signaling and breast cancer. His work right now revolves around Amgen's oncology clinical trials. But in addition, he collaborates with Amgen Ventures to bring blockchain-oriented platforms to Amgen and identify startup companies that develop blockchain-based applications that integrate into the clinical trial process. With Vladimir, we have Robert Markovic, CEO and founder of Health Linkages. Robert has more than 15 years experience on the software and IT side of healthcare and life sciences. That experience led him to development of the company Health Linkages, which looked at solving the data provenance problem in healthcare and life sciences using a combination of blockchain and big data. And finally, we have Edward Buxell, or Ed, like he likes to be called, CEO of Clinical Blockchain. Ed has 3 years of clinical data integration, data security, and communications experience. He has successfully licensed systems and services to companies, including international pharmaceutical and managed care organizations. He was a founding member of the ASTM E1238 standard that became integrated into HL7. In 2016, he founded Clinical Blockchain, a messaging system designed to enhance patient engagement, empowerment, facilitate shared decision-making, and improve outcomes of patient experience during clinical trials. So to sum it all up, we have the right people with the right background who understands technology, who understands the pharmaceutical framework, who understands the healthcare framework, all talking about this important application. And just to let you guys know who I am Maria Palambini. I'm the Director of Development and Initiatives with the IEEE Standards Association. And as you can see from the work that I do, it's the SMEs, like the people that we have on our panel today, to come together and look at these applications and how we can educate the industry at large about the application, but as well as look at opportunities for standards in these technologies so that we can actually make it easier for adoption into enterprise and industrial application. So, key learning points of this webcast, why we're all here today, we're going to understand how blockchain technology can tackle the patient engagement and recruitment challenge, how the aggregation of health data from the blockchain can improve data analytics in assessing clinical trial outcomes. We're going to understand a little bit the difference between private and public blockchain applications in clinical trials, and it's a very, very interesting dynamic, the difference between the two. And we're going to talk about how blockchain can close the gaps in clinical research that can accelerate drug development and improve patient safety and care. So we have a really great full presentation for you all today. And with that, I'd like to hand it over to Vladimir, who's going to give you the pharma perspective on clinical trials and blockchain.
Thank you for the introduction. And so today I'm going to give you a brief overview on some of the challenges in the current clinical trial process and potential opportunities for blockchain-based platforms to basically improve how the things are done. So obviously clinical trials are immensely important for healthcare and science in general, and usually they're a crucial step in testing any kind of new treatment for human diseases. In addition to that, they have a considerable economic impact, with clinical trials being a $14 billion market in the U.S. and projected to grow in the next years. We have about 90,000 registered trials at any time point in this country. So on the left-hand side of this slide, I'm showing you a simplified schematic of logistical setup of a typical clinical trial. So you have your sponsor, which is providing the funding. That's usually a pharmaceutical company that's testing a novel drug or a treatment. And the sponsor then engages one or more vendors, which are most typically CROs, contract research organizations, that do a lot of the groundwork in terms of setting up and operating a clinical trial. The vendors then engage several clinical sites. These are hospitals and clinics that house investigators, and the investigators then interact with patients. They basically inform them and enroll them into clinical trials. So you can see immediately from this type of architecture that there's a linear array of interactions, and that the sponsor and the patient are removed from each other by a number of intermediaries. In a similar manner, when data is provided back to the sponsor, it usually follows this sort of indirect path. And so in contrast to this, on the right-hand side, I am showing a schematic from a white paper that talks about a slightly different topic. It's about blockchain application in the medical claims process. And even though the participants in this process are different, this process kind of suffers from the same linear architecture. And what the authors propose here is sort of an example how to apply blockchain in general in this case, and introduce it as sort of a layer of integration to facilitate and control interactions between participants, and at the same time allow for the participants to interact more directly. And so this is a general overview, and in the next couple of slides I'm going to focus on several use cases and talk about more different segments of this process. The first process that I would like to talk about is patient recruitment and informed consent. So this is one of the initial steps in clinical trials, and this is the part where investigators basically enrolls patients and obtains their consent to participate in whatever experimental treatment they're going to be a part of. And currently there are several areas to improve upon here, and I would, first of all, there's the patient population is limited in clinical trials, and I would like to re-emphasize the staggering statistic that Maria already mentioned, that only 3 to 4% of cancer patients in the U.S. ever enroll in clinical trials. And if you look at this process from a patient perspective, they have to be in contact with the right investigator, who is a part of the clinical site that is then in contact with the right CRO that is contracted by the pharma company that is testing the drug in question. So it's not hard to imagine that a more distributed approach to patient recruitment and more direct interaction between the sponsor and the patient would would have a really positive impact on this issue. And one of the ideas is to use blockchain to distribute these interactions. Another hot topic, obviously, securing patient identity. And in this case, cryptography as one of the principal technologies behind blockchain can have a really significant effect. Patient IDs could be cryptographically secured and obscured by either issuing a token or a hash associated with patient, in which case they would be de-identified in this case, but easily verified by the right party with the proper set of information. There are also other privacy concerns related to access to patient data. So usually different portions of patient data can be accessed by different entities at different times. And use of blockchain in this process could definitely help enforce rules on how data is accessed and definitely increase transparency around access to patient data. Also, all the events related to patient recruitment, such as enrollment, consent, withdrawal, consent, data access could be logged on a blockchain and serve as proof that they occurred and at what time. And so all of these would make the process more reliable to both report and audit. So another use case for blockchain would be maintenance and access to patient data in the form of electronic records. And so there's a growing need in industry for sort of an open access data sharing model. And this comes from the fact that the huge amount of data is being generated on a daily basis from all the clinical trials. And technological advancement is only going to increase the pace of this data generation. And so you can imagine that for a single entity that is interested in research, having access to all of this data could be highly beneficial, and in the long run definitely would drive benefit for the patients. However, streamlining access to all this data is a very complex issue. It's data is kept in all these different databases, so there's a lot of system interoperability and accessibility problems. There are varying data standards. Some of these databases are new, some are very old, some have not been maintained properly for years. Also, there are inconsistent rules and permissions. And so this is a long-standing issue within the industry, and I think it's something that we're going to be hearing more and more about in the coming years. And we could imagine a system where blockchain could provide potentially a distributed framework to kind of support building a unified solution. However, it's fair to mention that also probably blockchain by itself is not going to be able to solve this issue, but it could provide initial framework to build upon. Another, and I would say more obvious use case for blockchain would be data provenance. And the need for improvement in this area comes from the current practices in the industry that can definitely be improved. So at the clinical sites, there's a lot of data manipulation, which is sometimes done manually, either by manually copying the file, sometimes even manually entering the numbers, introducing a lot of human error. Also, sometimes data exchange would rely on forwarding emails or even circulating paper copies. And so all of these practices make the audit trail to be very hard to follow and obscured. And if there is, let's say, a question about data integrity sometime down the road, it becomes a forensics task to go back in time and figure out at which point a file got corrupted, at which point the data got changed. So using a blockchain in this sphere can definitely help with auditability. And you can imagine a system where every change to a file can be logged onto a blockchain and easily tracked back in time. However, it's also fair to mention that blockchain by itself cannot be a substitute for an enterprise database because of the high data volume. So the amounts of data that can be stored on blockchain are highly limited. So another use case that I wanted to talk about is data generation and integrity. And by this, I mean all the data that's being generated at the CRO sites or within the pharma companies themselves. And a good example for this would be testing that is done on patient tissue samples, such as, for example, blood samples. And usually these are complex sets of experiments that are done at the CRO site. There are many variables that come into this, such as which protocol is used, sometimes even what instruments the reading has been done on, operators, a whole set of data analysis that follows the initial readings. And all of these variables can affect the results and change the final outcome of the experiment. On the other hand, these experiments are critical for any clinical trial because of the kind of information that is extracted from them. So we get information about whether the drug is hitting the target, how effective the drug is, if the patient's health is improving and by how much. And sometimes these readings are used to even direct future course of the therapy. So because of the importance of this, these experiments are usually done on a set of pre-validated rules. So there's a whole set of validation that precedes analysis of any clinical samples. And the sponsor and the CRO entered this basically contract where the CRO is contractually obligated to implement and follow all of these rules. However, the sponsor doesn't really have any control or even oversight on how this is done, and this interaction is dependent completely on trust between the sponsor and the CRO. So introducing a blockchain here as sort of a checkpoint layer to just ensure that the rules are in effect and that generated data is intact could eliminate or at least alleviate the need for trust between the parties. So this is my last slide, and here I would just like to summarize some of the advantages that inclusion of blockchain-based platforms could bring to the current process of clinical trials. So the system for storing any transaction records or data is distributed, which means it doesn't rely on a specific participant or even a part of the network. If a whole part of the network was to fail for some reason, the system would continue to operate without a problem. Network participants interact without establishing trust, nor there is a need for any central authority, which means there's not a single point of failure either. The store information is extremely redundant, and this is very important because data loss, whatever data is stored on blockchain, loss of this data is highly unlikely. On the flip side of this, there's a size limit of how much data can actually be stored and kept on the blockchain. All the information that's stored in blockchain is immutable, which is an extremely important property for building audit trails. So whatever is logged on is time-stamped and cannot be changed anymore on the blockchain. Also, blockchain platforms could be used to enforce pre-agreed upon rules. And another very important trait is that the accountability can be done in real time, meaning that if we are, for example, following a particular file and making sure that its integrity is intact, if there are any issues or any rules, if any rules are broken, this could be detected and red flags can be raised immediately, as opposed to how some of the things are done now, where you have to go back in time and kind of search for events that have happened outside of the rules. So I think this is one of the things that were greatly appealed to both pharmaceutical companies and regulators. And as a last remark, I would just like to touch upon the types of blockchain that people talk about when they talk about developing applications. So two main categories that they put them in are public and permission blockchains. So their main difference is in the way they're accessed. So public blockchains are open to any willing participants, while permission ones are kind of invite only. They also usually differ in the way, in the mechanism of security. So most typically it's a proof of work versus proof of stake. And they can differ greatly in scalability, meaning the number of transactions or data that can be logged on, with public blockchains being usually very limited in the amount of data that can be stored. And I think the most important thing when talking about these types of blockchains is to keep in mind that use of either of them is based on particular application or use case, and that neither is technically superior to the other. So with this, I'm going to finish, and thank you for your attention, and I'm going to hand it over to the next speaker.
So thank you very much, Vladimir. I think that was a really great setting the stage for understanding clinical trials and the potential applications for blockchain. So now, next we have Robert Markovic from Health Linkages. Robert?
Thank you very much. So hi, I'm Robert Markovic. I'm the founder and CEO of Health Linkages. We are the data provenance company. What I want to do is talk a little bit about, just continue on a little bit about what Vladimir was talking about as far as the use of different blockchains and different solutions for appropriate use cases. I think Vladimir touched on the fact that you do have different public chains, permission chains, and potentially even private blockchains, and they all have different uses for different purposes. And when you're looking at a particular use case and what you want to use your data for instance, in clinical trials, if you're looking at large amounts of data and maintaining the integrity and provenance of that data, you're looking for something that can handle a much higher transaction rate with much lower latency than you would expect out of a public blockchain. I think when you're, my main point here is when you're looking for things, you need to find the right fit for the right solution. And not every blockchain solution out there is the appropriate fit for a particular use case. So I'm going to dig into a couple of different use cases here, and before going into that, I want to describe one of the issues that we currently have with health data and with clinical trials data. And this is that we currently exist in a system where it's very difficult to both to share data and maintain the provenance of data. We have a lot of different systems, most of which are siloed systems. What you see in the slides is an example of what you may see in a healthcare situation, what you may see at the actual clinical site of a trial. And you see different information stored in different places. It's hard to get that information out. And when you do pull the information out, the systems were designed in such a way that they fit the old paper workflow method, that it's very easy to put data into the system, but it's difficult to get it out. And when you do manage to pull the data out, you end up losing a lot of the context of the data. For instance, if you take a specific data point, let's just say you're looking at a clinical trial patient and you want to just measure, let's say, their heart rate before, in a control situation and after they've been treated with the drug. How do you know which is which? Well, you have a number of data scientists that end up reconstructing the information after it's been ripped out of these systems. So it's very difficult as it currently stands with these siloed systems to maintain the context and the integrity of the data and to find structured data. This ends up, when you reconstruct the data, you end up having to do this with people, and as Vladimir also pointed out earlier in the presentation, this can lead to errors and incorrect data and incomplete data. And what a lot of people are starting to do is look at the implications for getting all of the data from clinical trials, using that with artificial intelligence or machine learning. The only problem with that is artificial intelligence and machine learning is only as good as the data that's put into it. If you have questionable data, you get inconclusive results, or in the worst case situation, you can get results that will send you on a wild goose chase and cost an awful lot of money. So the context is absolutely essential here. So what do you need to have good, high-quality data? You need the various things that blockchain can allow you to have. And we're looking at blockchain with regard to granular data from clinical trials here. By using a blockchain-based system, and this wouldn't really matter whether it's a public blockchain, private permission blockchain, or even a private permission chain, you do get an immutable audit trail. You get mathematical proof of the integrity of the data, that the state of the data is exactly the same when you're looking at the data for analysis as when it was collected. You know the data is secure. You're able to share that with a full event history, a chain of provenance, and you're able to maintain the context of the data. All of these things are absolutely essential for doing data analysis in the future. So one of the big things that's been, I'm a little surprised there hasn't been more discussion about this, is that the European Union adopted a new set of general data protection regulations, which goes into effect in May of next year. Any organizations, whether it be CROs, sponsors, various clinical sites, that are processing personal data of any EU citizens, no matter where they might be located, now have to comply by these regulations, which include a breach notification duty, the right to be forgotten, data portability, consent, privacy, and the right to access the data. Blockchain-based systems make this considerably easier. You're able to maintain the privacy of the data, create consent, and be able to prove consent of the data, allow people the right to be forgotten because you can hide the data from people. It's very important, and blockchain can be a huge part of the solution to maintaining compliance with GDPR. So I just want to go through this, and this is just a brief example of one of the parts of blockchain. And this is an example of a Merkle tree, and I'm hoping that this will give people an idea of what blockchain can actually do for people and how it can maintain the integrity and show any potential corruption of the data or any other reasons the data might be off. So if we actually have a couple of, let's say we're taking a couple of vitals in a clinical trial, we're looking at blood glucose and temperature. If you can, we take those values and we do a one-way encryption called a hash. So now we have a hash value in addition to the actual data points. The great thing about blockchain is you end up creating a tree. So you end up hashing these values together and continue on. And then it gets hashed to the previous root, and so on and so on. What this ends up doing is the hash of every data point is connected directly to the hash of every other data point within this chain. Therefore, when there's any problem, you're able to determine exactly where this problem potentially happens, where you may need to look at, and as Vladimir also mentioned, this is great both for pharma companies to maintain the integrity of the data as well as for regulators. If you could advance real quickly, Maria, I'll show an example that if you did have, say, a piece of data which was questioned, which no longer added up here, the hash no longer added up, this ends up and continue on getting propagated, and you can, as a result of this, know exactly where the problem happened, know when the problem happened, and based on the design of your system, you can also actually know the last person who touched the data. That's why you can ensure the integrity of the data, know that it's in exactly the same state as you had before, and you have a full trail of provenance, so you know the exact event history of every data point. So I'm going to look at two use cases right here, one of which is the data analytics use cases. There are a number of ways to do this, but if you want, you can either use permission chains for this. You could theoretically use public blockchains, but what I'm going to look at right here is using what would essentially be a private permission chain. So you would have a blockchain, which would be essentially within a small consortium, could be entirely behind the firewall of one enterprise. What this allows you to do is manage all of the data for the clinical trials. You can maintain that on blockchain, be able to know where this data came from, have a full chain of provenance. And if the data is spread amongst multiple sites and institutions, you could have this on a single system and allow people to permission access to the information. You'd end up having visibility into the integrity and the provenance of the data and be able to prove mathematically that that data is intact, and for an auditor, show that this data has been within your control and audited the entire time this existed. There's one other thing that's very interesting about this too, is if you've got information in different institutions, you can save this all on a chain. You can share this information. One of the important things I think that Vladimir was mentioning is that blockchains can be not only a tool in itself, it can be part of a greater solution. One of the things that we've done at Health Linkages is allow people to share that data without showing the data to the other institutions. Now let's take a look at this. For instance, let's imagine that you're two separate pharmaceutical companies and you had clinical trial data. This is an asset to a pharmaceutical company. You don't want to hand this off to another company that although you may be looking to do a joint venture with someone, in which case you could get a new asset and share in the revenues. How would you actually go about doing that without sharing that data with other people? Well, the blockchain enables a solution in which you'd be able to do this. And once again, this is not a blockchain itself that does this. This is a blockchain-enabled solution, which allows you to use the cryptography in the blockchain to share this information without divulging the input information to the other parties. So another way of doing it is private sharing of data. But I hope I allow people to see some of the uses that some of the things that you can do with blockchain technology and how this could be used in clinical trials. I'd like to pass this off to Maria and Ed for the next set of slides.
Well, thank you very much, Robert. And I just want to let everybody know that we see all your questions coming in, and they're actually all very, very good. And once we get through all the presentations, I think that maybe some of those questions will already be answered, but we will make sure to get to as many as we can. So I'd like to hand it off to Ed with clinical blockchain.
Thank you very much, Maria, and thank you very much for hosting this important webinar. For those of you that have joined or are familiar with blockchain, we're already experiencing probably a stage 2 as far as the tools and applications that are available. It's absolutely been incredible, the speed of innovation in blockchain. And just to follow on with what Vladimir set up in a very excellent baseline, the reason why pharma and clinical trials are so very important is that the clinical trials recruitment process includes incentives that are paid to patients in order to join a clinical trial. And those incentives traditionally are doled out by investigators. So in the case of a pharmaceutical clinical trial, the investigator truly is an intermediary, just like the Western Union and money transfer agents, which were obviously the initial focus of Bitcoin and Bitcoin blockchain in cutting out certain intermediaries. So this is a perfect use case for a blockchain. Now, we've got a situation, especially when you consider patients and physicians or healthcare providers, where there's an issue where the patient and the physician or healthcare provider already know each other. There's a certain amount of trust that already exists. Now, one of the Bitcoin's fundamental aspects is the ability to create trust in an environment. Now, the situation that we're looking at with pharmaceutical companies and clinical trials is that they, at one point in time, at least initially, a patient enrolled in a trial may have no information about the pharmaceutical company other than what they read, and the pharmaceutical company obviously has no reason to know much about the patient until they're enrolled in a trial. But in the once again, in the general case of healthcare, we do have a situation where trust is always assumed, and so the next step is in taking a look at how we balance what are the potential benefits of a blockchain in a clinical trial, is to really take a look at the incentive aspects of a patient being recruited into a clinical trial, and that's primarily what the issue faces. Blockchain, I believe Robert mentioned this very specifically. Blockchain is not a fit for all cases, and it's a matter of really identifying the niches where blockchain really makes sense. Trying to automate or create smart contracts for every aspect of healthcare just really doesn't make much sense in a blockchain type of scenario. But there are very specific areas where adding a blockchain layer or incorporating blockchain into the fabric of an application and workflow will make sense. And in fact, as we talk about blockchain, it's probably the case that most people, as blockchain is further deployed in these types of applications, that people won't even know that blockchain is being utilized. In fact, when we sit and utilize internet applications, we don't know anything about HTTP or other foundational protocols for communicating information. What we do know is that the application hopefully works. And specifically, and I apologize for the busy slide, but there's a lot of information here. Pharmaceutical companies have already identified and found that the traditional method of reaching out to patients vis-a-vis a investigator has pretty much failed, and the potential of blockchain to reach many people and connect them in an anonymous fashion with pharmaceutical companies makes sense right now. For instance, instead of utilizing the traditional process where a pharmaceutical company recruits an investigator, and then the investigator goes ahead and recruits patients for a specific clinical trial, that model has, in many cases it's worked, but in many cases it's proven to be a failure. And what we see is certain drug companies working to identify locations and identify locations by identifying first not necessarily the investigator in a particular location to perform a study, but I actually identify whether or not there's a cohort of patients that would be interested in participating in a particular clinical trial. And blockchain, through its anonymity features and ability to share information, presents a very interesting model to enable this particular case. Now, what we see very quickly is we see that there are, as Vladimir mentioned, 3 to 4% of patients, of cancer patients, which you would think that would be a pretty motivated group in the rare disease realm, participate in clinical trials. You would expect that group would be motivated to make those numbers significantly greater than 3 to 4%. But we do see a group that's out there which literally they're carrying around medical records in binders, and the ability to have portability as a patient moves from one provider to another provider and record information on a record or that is immutable like a blockchain makes perfect sense. And we're looking at this patient. This group actually represents a very significant population where, in some cases, these patients could be worth to any individual healthcare organization, $1 million to $2 million and more per year in billings. And it's estimated that there's about 33 million of these patients in the United States alone, as reported by the New York Times about a year ago. The primary item that I really want to hit on is some of the architectures and civics of creating a system that's going to work for patients and work for entities that are helping patients. And there's a number of tools that have been developed. For instance, a company called Blockstack has created a phenomenal tool that actually allows the creation of an identity for an individual, and then allows information to be stored in multiple locations and then referenced on a blockchain. As Robert and Vladimir pointed out, blockchain is not necessarily a very good system for storing information due to size limitations and as well as certain speed issues regarding transactions. But what blockchain is extremely good at is atomizing information and making the information somewhat portable. And in the case of patients will be able to identify exactly what information that they wish to share. For instance, a patient may wish to share that they are a diabetic, and if a pharmaceutical company is interested in finding diabetics, that information can be shared on a national or international level, and the pharmaceutical company may not know initially who that patient is, but they may know that that there's a single point that they are interested in. For instance, that the patient has diabetes. Now, if the pharmaceutical company chooses to engage that initially anonymous patient with an additional question, for instance, is the patient taking a drug like metformin, or what is the patient's blood glucose? Those specific items could still be transacted between a pharmaceutical company and a patient directly, without necessarily breaching any type of or passing any additional personal health information, which is a very, very unique aspect for the blockchain. Now, when considering any type of a system going forward, one of the areas that needs to be looked at, and we're looking at literally hundreds, if not thousands, of blockchain applications and cryptocurrencies. The numbers up above 1,500 to 1,600. Obviously, people have seen Bitcoin, Ethereum, Zcash, and other types of coins out there, but there are many out there, and the big issue that we need to address going forward is the issue of potentially interoperability between chains. There's going to be an important need for, if a patient, let's say, is from the Philadelphia area and they need to exchange information with an organization that may have their own private blockchain in Seattle or Chicago, what type of interoperability is going to be there? Because if one thing is true in healthcare, the interoperability mesh is that we're facing today. We don't want to create that mesh and extend it to blockchain, which is obviously cryptographically secure, which means the silos are going to be even locked down tighter than they are right now. And just as an example, everybody thinks of blockchain as being absolutely immutable. This entire area is moving very quickly, and there are technologies out there utilizing blockchain and being proposed that essentially make blockchain somewhat mutable, or at least certain records deletable. So it's important for, and it's actually a system and protocol called Lightning that actually increases the speed of the Bitcoin blockchain, which is one of the slowest blockchains, to over 2,000 plus transactions per second. And in order to do that, records are actually deleted. Now, one of the issues, and we spoke earlier about permission versus public blockchains. Now, the issue on a public blockchain, identity is a very, very specific item that blockchain addresses very well. In fact, there's about 25 different companies out there, just blockchain-specific companies, having various identity solutions. But the issue becomes, if you're a patient in a clinical trial, how do you go ahead and really confirm whether or not an organization in the digital realm is truly a pharmaceutical company? If they're asking for information, are they, someone in Bulgaria trying to get some information about individuals across the globe, or are they, how do you identify them? So identity becomes extremely important, and there's a number of companies from and by the same token also, how does a pharmaceutical company actually understand or confirm that a patient is truly a patient? For instance, does the patient actually have diabetes, or is this someone trying to potentially game the system? So identity management and identity systems on the blockchain are very, very important. And this involves validation and verification and authentication to identify whether or not someone is actually real or and unique, or if someone is a phony or a fraud. And this, as I mentioned, there's companies such as Uport, Civic, Blockstack, and more than 20 companies that are trying to address this issue. And this field is moving very, very quickly. One of the reasons that we've discussed, data and health data was this, has already been discussed. Data comes in a lot of different flavors, and once the blockchain has and the ability to reference various data in various flavors makes perfect sense. But that does not necessarily mean that data will be interoperable. I would say it's very analogous to a card catalog in a library, and in some cases you don't recognize whether or not the books are written in Spanish, German, English, or French. But the bottom line is that blockchain can at least bring this information together for in one place and reference it on one identity. And that's it. Thank you very much.
We have about 10 minutes left, or actually about 5 or 6, and I want to try to get as many good questions that we receive from the audience. And I think a lot of the questions are really questions about, challenges, I would say. So I think one of the first questions that was really interesting was, will the role of blockchain help the investigator or eliminate them?
I would think it would be dependent upon how it's actually implemented. I think it could certainly help the investigator and allow the investigator to, the investigator needs to have, it depends on the trial, right? But in most trials, you need to actually have the investigator there collecting the information with the patient. But if you collect it directly into a blockchain-based system, whether that, and allow them to collect the data in that manner, I think it would really help them, and I think it would actually make life considerably easier for them. But once again, it does depend on the particular circumstances.
Vladimir?
Yeah, that's a great point. I would just like to add that I also agree that in most cases it would help investigators, but you can also imagine a situation where there's, for example, a migraine trial which could be self-reported, and where you might potentially have patients use their devices like cell phones to interact directly with the sponsor and basically self-report and self-administer the drug.
Yeah, well, 100% agree. I think it will, in some cases, it'll help the investigator, but the potential of creating a relationship directly between the sponsor and the patient and not necessarily having to go through an investigator is something that blockchain could certainly bring to the fore.
Just want to throw in there that it's going to depend on the particular trial. And I mean, there are some trials that are going to need to have an investigator there under, that's just not going to be able to do it without them.
So one of the other questions we got, because everybody's fresh with the Equifax breach on their mind, is, given that, how prone, pretty much is how safe is blockchain? Is it going to, how prone will people's health data be on the blockchain? Could it be like another Equifax breach?
I would say the answer is, once again, it's blockchain. If you're in a situation and you have your data on a blockchain and you store your private key in a system that potentially is vulnerable, then that will be a human error that will allow a breach to occur. So, as far as the cryptography and the computing situation, blockchain is incredibly secure. The problem is people are not very secure.
Yeah, Ed just nailed it. I think the main thing is it's similar to, just imagine that nobody could break into your email account through the server. And that's pretty much the situation you have with blockchain. It's still dependent upon your password. If you give your password to somebody else, somebody can get into the system. And it's the same thing with the private key that Ed's discussing right there. That's the human factor.
And I'd just like to add that all of the sort of breaches in the sphere of cryptocurrencies are 100% human error. The science behind the blockchain is solid, and that has never been hacked, to my knowledge, yet.
In fact, with the current systems out there, assuming somebody's using the typical SHA-256, it would take somebody theoretically over a lifetime to actually break that.
So, Vladimir, one of the questions we got for you was, what is the advantage of blockchain over an enterprise database that would be available to participants in a clinical trial?
So definitely I'd like to mention that blockchain is not a substitute for a database. And the main reason for this is that data that can be stored in blockchain is very limited. And blockchain can be used to sort of track or log all the events that are happening within the database. But I don't think it's very likely that the entirety of a database will ever be able to store it on a blockchain. So there will always have to be some sort of a database that can be built upon or in conjunction with the blockchain.
I totally agree with you there, Vladimir. The blockchain doesn't end up being a storage unit there. Blockchain ends up being some of the implementations we've done, we've used blockchain as a persistence layer above a main database. So you allow people to maintain track of the data there. Whether or not you put data on the blockchain is once again dependent upon use case, but for the most case with health data, you wouldn't necessarily want to include that information on a blockchain because at some point in time, typically that data needs to be disposed of. And if you do that on a blockchain, you run into a huge problem.
Right. Very good point. Okay, everyone. So it's 3 o'clock, and I really wish we would have had another half hour because we had really great questions, but I want to be respectful of everybody's time. I want to thank everyone for coming. As the purpose of this webcast is obviously to share with the community all the different initiatives we're doing here at the IEEE with regards to, we have a few incubations program, and I've put some information on the slide which will also be available for everybody for download. We have some interesting workshops coming up in blockchain applications for clinical trials and for the pharmaceutical supply chain in the next 2 to 3 months. And there, hopefully, you can get more answers to a lot of the good questions that you're asking. And for now, I just want to, again, thank everybody. And if you have any questions, you can write to me, and I'll be happy to forward it on to any of the panelists. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Yeah, we'd be happy to answer any questions anybody has. So please forward them to Maria.
Thank you very much, Maria. Take care.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks a lot.